David Hale, thank you very much for joining us here at the Fung Global Institute. Let me start now by one of the pressing issues in Asia, the situation on the Korean Peninsula. You were in Seoul very recently. Could you describe the atmosphere there?
Well, generally, there's a feeling the risk of war is very limited. But one of the goals of the U.S. maneuvers last week with South Korea was to make it very clear to Kim Jung-Un he could not do what his father did 3 years ago and launch an attack on South Korean naval vessels or an island and get away with it, that there will be prompt and immediate retaliation. So they want to very much remind him that he doesn't have that freedom of action. And the problem is, we don't really know who rules North Korea. Kim Jong-un is clearly nominally in charge, has been since his father passed away 15 months ago, but there's lots of second guessing as to who's influential with him. He has an uncle who was married to the sister of his father, and they've always been influential. But how much influence they have right now, we don't know exactly. A year ago, Kim Jong-un removed the top commander of the North Korean army. That was a clear sign of him consolidating power, doing something quite dramatic. But the fact is, he still needs to rely very much on the army. The army has their own generals, their own commanders, and it's not clear what they think about the situation. So North Korea remains very opaque, full of uncertainty, because we don't fully understand how they make decisions, how they actually govern themselves.
You spoke just now about the situation on the Korean Peninsula.
Yeah.
Now, while the rest of Asia is trying to come together, the North Koreans, from a certain point of view, are agitating. How does this affect the dynamic in that part of the world?
Well, it means that we have uncertainty. It means there's a certain discount to the valuation of Korean equities. It means we're always on guard for what could be a totally unpredictable attack. The fact that Kim Jong-un is making statements here in the last 2 weeks about launching an attack on North America or U.S. military bases means, of course, it won't happen. When the Korean War happened back in 1950, it took everybody by surprise, and therefore the attack was quite successful in the early days. But the fact is, we don't fully know how the North Koreans make decisions. We don't quite know how Kim Jong-un fits in vis-a-vis other major players, and therefore all we can do is guess and carry on as best we can with limited knowledge and limited information.
How do you think that's affecting the economic situation on the ground in South Korea?
South Korea's economy has slowed quite dramatically over the last 18 months, partly because of weaker exports with a sluggish global economy, and partly because the Korean household sector is quite heavily indebted. They've had a high level of debt for a few years, and this is now constraining consumer spending. The government announced measures on Monday to promote home ownership, to try and increase real estate activity. That might, on the margin, be a positive for the real estate market and encourage some increase in demand for furniture and things like that. But it looks like the Korean growth rate this year could be just 2 to 2.5%, not as robust as it was in the aftermath of the global financial crisis back in 2010.
North Korea then is probably the last remaining closed state on Earth. Let's turn to another state now that was formerly closed, Myanmar.
Yes.
And you were there recently.
Yes.
Describe the atmosphere there. What's happening in your eyes?
Well, Myanmar is now suddenly a boomtown. There's a huge influx of capital looking for opportunities. A lot of businessmen are going there, a lot of consultants, a lot of investment bankers, private equity funds, all trying to find the right way to play this boom. The reality is Myanmar is a very backward country. After the military coup in 1962, it was totally isolated. The Western countries also had sanctions over the last 20 years. Myanmar lost its textile industry 15 years ago to Bangladesh because of these sanctions. So it's a very, very poor country, emerging now from a very long period of stagnation and isolation. But the reality is the country has 60 million people, has a lot of natural resources. There will be lots of opportunities for making money if you can find the right partners, if you can find the right people to go forward with. There's now 2 Myanmar stocks listed on the Singapore Stock Exchange. One's a real estate company. A year ago, the stock cost 10 cents. Now it's up to 70 cents. So you've got a sign here in the Singapore stock market that people are looking for ways to play Myanmar. But the reality is there's no stock market there. There's only a few companies from Myanmar listed in foreign markets, so it's hard to find a way in. But there's a huge amount of activity, and there's a real tourism boom underway. Last year, Myanmar had 300,000 tourists. This year, 800,000. They believe in 2015, maybe 3 million. To put it in perspective, Thailand last year had 15 million tourists, so they're still way behind Thailand. But they have a wide range of assets which can help to attract tourists. Yangon itself is like Bangkok 30 or 40 years ago. It's a sprawling Asian city. It doesn't have very many attractive features. But there are in the interior ancient cities 1,000 years old that were the capital of Myanmar at that time. And these are like Angkor Wat in Cambodia. This is why tourists will go to see the country, to see these more ancient ruins and things like that. So if they can get 3 million tourists in 3 years, that's a tremendous shot in the arm for the economy. And indeed, right now, it's hard to get a hotel room. If I had not been speaking at a conference with on-the-ground sponsors, I would have found it very difficult to get a hotel room. I also would have had a hard time getting a visa. I tried to get the visa at the Burmese embassy in Washington, but because of the demand, it took a whole month to get a visa. I didn't have that kind of time, but fortunately, my conference organizers on the ground in Yangon got me a visa when I arrived at the airport. So there is some flexibility, but the fact is the country is quite backward. 2 years ago, you could not use credit cards there. Now you can use credit cards in some hotels and some restaurants, but not by any means all of them. It still is very much a cash-based financial system. You can't get mortgages. It's still very much at the development stage. It's a lot like East Asia 30 or 40 years ago.
Asia has a bit of a mixed record, though, on sustainable development and sustainable growth. Myanmar could be said to be at a fork in the road.
Yeah.
So where do you think this fork will go? Which path do you think they'll take?
Well, they've now appointed a variety of cabinet ministers who I met with, all of whom favor foreign investment, favor trade, and opening up of the economy to interaction with the outside world. So the new government that took power 2 years ago has made a decision to basically liberalize the economy, open up, and to liberalize politics as well. Aung San Suu Kyi is now a member of parliament. In the by-elections last April, her party won 45 seats, a tremendous victory, given the fact that in the first election 2 years ago, they had no seats at all. So it's both a political and economic opening, and all we can do is watch and wait and see how it plays out. But so far, the military is allowing this to happen. It looks like they recognized 3 and 4 years ago their country had become very, very backward. They also are becoming fearful of China. Because of all the Western sanctions, the only country investing in Myanmar 3 and 4 years ago was China. And China got big projects for pipelines, railways, hydro facilities. And last year, the Burmese government stunned the Chinese by canceling a big hydro project, a multi-billion-dollar deal they were sure would go ahead. And they did that because of local opposition and the fact the country is now trying to be democratic. You can see this in the data for FDI. Chinese FDI in Myanmar in 2011 was $2.5 billion. 2012, only $200 million. China has been the big loser from this opening. Now, China is right next door. There's many Chinese live in Myanmar. China will always be important for Myanmar. It'll be a market, it'll be a source of capital, but it won't be nearly as dominant as it might have been under the old regime and the old rules. There now will be true competition from Western companies. Already lots of Singaporeans are there doing business, the Thais are there doing business. Now coming in also are the Americans, the Australians, other Western countries.
Let's talk about sustainable development in Myanmar. Myanmar, as you mentioned, is very resource rich. It's very resource rich in minerals, in precious metals, in forestry, in teak. But
yes,
there is a danger here that Myanmar could take the fork in the road that doesn't benefit it long term.
Yeah. Whenever a country, after a long period of isolation and repression, enters a period of takeoff, there's always a danger the boom could get out of control. And I can see some businessmen rushing into Myanmar with the wrong partners, the wrong relationships, to make various deals and doing quite badly over 2 or 3 years. And right now, to operate there, you really need local partners. And the problem is there's a very large supply. There's a limited number of people who understand Western business and things like that. The real estate company, for example, listed in Singapore is run by a guy who worked in China for 20 years. He lived in Hong Kong for 10 years. He's truly international, cosmopolitan, but people like him are quite rare. So yes, sustainable development is a very valid question, and the danger is when you have a boom like this, it gets out of control. There will be environmental damage, more pollution, things like that. The challenge now will be for the World Bank, the IMF, the international organizations giving advice to try and guard against this. And the World Bank is very sensitive now on environmental issues and things like that. So since they're playing a role behind the scenes giving advice, with luck this will make some difference. But it's a boom time environment, so all we can do is really just watch and see how it plays out. There are 2 major booms going on right now in this region. Myanmar is one, the other one is Mongolia. Mongolia, again, is natural resources. It's copper mines, uranium mines, gold mines, huge coal deposits. Mongolia's GDP could probably triple in 2 or 3 years because of all the development potential. And Mongolians, again, like the Myanmar people, are concerned about having China dominate everything. They've actually, in the last few months, blocked some Chinese investments. They're getting capital from the big global mining companies. The big global mining companies tend to be Australian, Canadian, British, not just Chinese. And for Mongolia, this will also be quite an awesome challenge.